Hello and welcome back to my channel and welcome to 2024. I hope you had a fantastic Christmas and you're having a great new year. Now, what better way to celebrate the new year than to look back at the old year? And I thought today what I'd do is sum up my year in film, the films that I've enjoyed watching over 2023. Now, first of all, each year in January I have a little tradition. Since about the year 2000, I've done a list of my 100 favourite films of all time, choosing one film per director. And over the years, I've tweaked this. Every January, I tweak it and add to it. It's now a list of my top 450 films, each film by a different director, okay? So you won't see loads of films by Ozu or by Carl Dreyer or by Kubrick, so some of your favourites might not be on the list. But it's a list of all the directors and films that matter to me. I'm going to leave a link to it below. You can find it on my website. But also for the first time this year on my website, I'm publishing my top 100 films without any rules. Okay, so not just one film per director, but just the top 100 films for me, my desert island movies. So I'm publishing that for the first time, and I've arranged it in chronological order by year. So you'll also get a link to that at the bottom. Now, each year in December, I get an email from Senses of Cinema. This is an Australian website, and they asked me for my top 10, and I've published my top 10 on that site for about 22 years. This year was the first year since I've started doing it. I just couldn't find 10 new films that I thought were worth putting in a top 10. How depressing is that? New Year is a bit depressing, isn't it? And I just couldn't come up, of the new films I saw last year, I just couldn't come up with a list of 10 that I actually thought were worth a dime, let alone worthy of putting in a top 10 list. So I decided to do something different, and that is I would choose my top 10 discoveries of the year, both old and new. Because it seems to me that if you see an older film, doesn't matter if it's 60, 70 years old for the first time, it's new to you, it's contemporary to you, and it's changing the way you think about the medium. So why not pick it? But I limited myself, the older films, I limited myself to films that have been kind of rediscovered this year, either because they've been re-released at the cinema or they've been rediscovered on Blu-ray or DVD, so that they had a sort of contemporariness about it. It wasn't just me seeing this movie and thinking, oh, that's great. It was something that's been collectively rediscovered. So these are my 10 best discoveries of 2023. Now, first of all, we have Alias Nick Beale. I've talked about this on the channel before. I absolutely love this movie. It's part of my discovery of John Farrow, who's a kind of forgotten Hollywood director of the 40s and 50s. He was, of course, Mia Farrow's dad. And John Farrow turns out to have been a really interesting director. I love his style. He largely worked in film noirs and thrillers, but with a bit different, a bit off-kilter. And this one is a beautifully shot, beautifully staged, weird mix of gritty film noir mixed with the supernatural, so that the Ray Milland character, who's this kind of weird fixer, this kind of ominous presence, could actually be Satan himself. Some people might not like it, but I was really taken by it, and I love Farrow's style, the way he shoots often in medium shot, his use of space, the work he does with actors is excellent. I really love this movie. I never expected to see a sort of realistic, gritty genre like film noir, mixed with the sort of supernatural ghost story, the fable. And I love Ray Milland, and I love this movie. I thought it was absolutely charming. Something completely different. Baxter Vera Baxter. This year, Criterion released one of my favourite films of all time. You'll find it on my top 100 list. Marguerite Duras' India Song from the 1970s. And Baxter Vera Baxter was put on as an extra. I'd never seen it before. And this is one of my favourite discoveries of the year. Now, you know how a lot of people have this sort of image of, this kind of cliched image of European art film. There's lots of people wandering around. It's very slow and boring. No one does anything. And you get people going like, l'amour, oui, l'amour, la mort, oui, la mort. That kind of thing. Well, this is that movie, right? So if you don't like European art house movies, which are very slow and pretentious, You ain't gonna like this movie. Just avoid it like the plague. Marguerite Duras is a director I'm kind of weirdly obsessed with. But I'm perfectly willing to admit she's that kind of art house director that most people cannot stand and brings them out in hives. She makes these kind of weirdly somnambulist movies where people sort of wander around in a daze, with interior monologues, not really speaking to each other, like kind of like sort of animated zombies or cadavers in these kind of eerily lit spaces. This movie, Baxter Vera Baxter, is about this sort of middle class woman having difficulties with her husband. She rents an apartment, a house by the sea in this French seaside resort. And the film is about who she is and what she's doing. And it starts with these characters talking about her. And then one of them goes to visit her. Now, when one of the other characters goes to visit her, something strange happens. On the soundtrack, this South American folk band, that sort of, all that stuff, comes up in the soundtrack in the background. And it never goes away for the entire film. 9/10 of the film, you have this endless sort of panpipes band on the soundtrack. God, it's irritating. But somehow it blends into the dreamlike quality of the film. And I found it absolutely riveting. I don't know why, I can't explain it. But it's a strangely beautiful, oniric film. For those people who like the crystal meths, the hard liquor of world cinema, your 100% vodka, try it. Next, now, many people who've been watching this channel regularly will know that in the past year, I've been doing a retrospective of Michael Powell, the great British filmmaker. And in that retrospective, I said that his film Peeping Tom, which came out in 1960, was his last great film. I may have been a bit precipitate. In fact, they've done a Michael Powell season at the BFI in London, and they re-released at the cinema and on Blu-ray this film, Bluebeard's Castle, which I'd never seen before. And this, I think, is Powell's last great work. I'm going to do a separate video on this for those people who've been following my Michael Powell retrospective, because it's worth it. And suffice to say, this is a filmed opera of a very little known opera by Bela Bartok, a modernist opera, right? And I'm not an opera buff. I couldn't tell you anything about opera. And I loved watching this. I thought it was visually and hourly intense and beautiful. And I can't recommend it highly enough. And for someone who's not an opera buff, and if someone, for example, who's not terribly keen on Tales of Hoffmann by Michael Powell, that is quite a recommendation. As I say, I think this video is worth a separate video on its own. I will do that for Michael Powell fans. But this is something very, very special. Get hold of it if you can. Next, a new film. Yes, a modern film. By one of my favourite directors in the last 20 years, Koreeda Hirogatsu, his film Broker. This was the first film he made in Korea with some famous Korean actors. This got a bit of a lukewarm response when it was released, I think at the Cannes Film Festival last year. I loved it. It's a very baggy movie. It's about people who are sort of, brokers are people who are trying to sell children in Korea to couples who want a baby and they can't get a baby, so he sort of traffics children. And that might make it sound very dark. It's not. It's a very light, very humanist fable. Koreeda is one of the very few directors currently working who still makes light, well-characterised, beautiful, humanist fables. And I really love them. I think they're beautifully acted. They're full of life and hope and humanity and all those old cliches. And I just think he just makes very enjoyable films, that are accessible to anyone who chooses to watch them. So if you've not seen this, give it a try. I loved it. One of my favourite movies of the year. Now, I did a separate video trying to push this film, which I think was unsuccessful. I think it's still got less than 100 views. Elmar Lamar. Okay, I admit, it's not everyone's cup of tea. It's an essay film about the Sonoran Desert, which is on the borders of America. It's the desert that most immigrants coming from South and Central America go through to get into the US illegally. And it's a sort of impressionist essay portrait of this space. I love this movie, one of my favourite movies of the last 10 years. It's so beautiful, it's eerily atmospheric, but it's also very powerful. And it's a brilliant portrait of a particular space. I like that kind of psychogeography, how the space and the people in it creates its own kind of world, its own kind of ecology, if you like. I love that aspect of this film. It's a really great movie. I know that it might not be very appealing, but try it. Give it a try something different. I think you'll find it very rewarding. If nothing else, it's very physically beautiful. The use of sight and sound on the soundtrack. It's a very beautiful film. Now, I think I'm one of only about 3 people in the entire universe who likes this next film, Ben Wheatley's latest folk horror film, In the Earth. Now, look, I'm going to admit this to you. This isn't a very good film, really. But it ticks all my boxes. It's folk horror. It's got a bit of Nigel Neal, Quatermass, the mixture of science and old earth forces coming back, standing stones and, witchcraft and all that, out in the woods with beautiful sort of 80s style electronic music. If you like all that kind of thing, this is catnip, this movie. Really, Ben Wheatley is just indulging himself. He made it during lockdown, actually. And he's just indulging himself in all these, fetishes, that people of mine and his generation love. If you like the Stone Tape, if you like the Wicker Man, if you like BBC Ghost Stories for Christmas, if you like sort of 80s electronica music, you will love this movie. It's just, it's like kids wallowing in a sort of ball pit, It's that kind of movie. Don't take it too seriously. Don't look for narrative. But if you just enjoy those elements, you'll have a party. It's great. Now, a film that brought me up short because it was not what I was expecting. I've talked about this in other videos. Mademoiselle by Tony Richardson. Tony Richardson was the darling of British cinema in the early 60s with films like, Look Back in Anger and The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. He was the big director of the Kitchen Sink School, the Angry Young Men School of early 60s cinema, which I have to say I don't really much care for, right? And then in the mid-60s, he went to France. And he made a French art film, and the critics absolutely slayed him. They destroyed him. And it's one of the biggest flops and one of the most derided films ever. This year, it was released on BFI, and I thought I'd check it out, and I got a big surprise. I loved it. First of all, visually stunning movie. Wonderful performance by Jean Moreau. I love the sort of fairy tale atmosphere. I think the original critics took it too literally. It's a fairy tale, oniric. I've used that word twice. I hardly ever use that word, but I used it twice in this video. Sort of dreamlike fable. I think they were expecting something more nouvelle vague, and that's why they crucified him. But it's more than that. It's sort of closer to something like, I don't know, Company of Wolves or a sort of Southern Gothic film but made in France. I love it to pieces. Next is a film that was actually suggested to me by one of my subscribers, Chloe Chow's film, The Rider, which is a wonderful portrait of a young man who works as a rodeo worker in the States, and he has a terrible accident, and he has to face a choice about whether to get back in the saddle, literally, or whether to change his life. It's actually a bit of art imitating life. The young man in question, who plays the central part, is a rodeo worker in real life, and he had a terrible accident. In real life, actually, he went straight back to work, interestingly enough. And if you get the British DVD of this film, there is a full interview with this guy at the BFI, and basically he's asked one question and he goes into a monologue for about 15 minutes. He's an incredibly articulate young man, and he explains what happened, this incredible accident. I mean, how he survived, I don't know. And then he went, I think it was about 2-3 weeks afterwards, he went back to work. So the drama of the film is quite different from what happened in real life, but he was quite eloquent. He said, I had to go back to work, it was my job, that's what I do. The film, one of the reasons I like the film, it's a very simple, accessible film. It's very rare these days to see an American film that is so sensitive to blue-collar life and is not at all patronising or condescending about it. And that's what I really enjoyed about it. You sense that the filmmaker was not trying to make a political or ideological point. She wasn't boxing these people into a corner to make a comment on them, but to celebrate their life, their passion, their commitment, their dedication, and their relationship with each other. And I found that so refreshing. I don't remember who advised me to watch that film, but whoever it was, thank you very much, because I really, really appreciated it and I enjoyed it very much. Next, the filmmaker who I keep pushing on this channel and I keep trying to tell everyone is the best filmmaker currently working, Hong Sang-soo, Korean filmmaker. I caught up with two of his latest movies, The Novelist's Film and Walk Up. Both of these releases thanks to the Cinema Guild in New York in America. I have to pay a fortune for these with import fees, but they're worth every penny. These two films were, by a country mile, the best new films of the year. Absolutely slaughtered everything else in sight. They're not mentioned once in the recent Sight and Sound Top 50 Films of the Year, and that tells you everything you need to know about modern film criticism. Now, I can understand people who are not used to Hong Sang-soo's films. These two films might seem very indulgent, okay? In each case, the lead character is a filmmaker in late middle age, just like Hong Sang-soo. So there's a bit of navel-gazing going on. But despite that, they are, the intense and strange beauty of them beats everything else into a cocked hat. This is a movie about a female filmmaker who has come back from the dead. Everyone's kind of written her off. Well, actually, she's a writer, She's a writer who's come back from the dead. And she decides now she wants to move into film. And it's just about her getting a team together, a crew together. It's one of the strangest, most lyrical films I've seen in recent times. And the central actress, God, I've forgotten her name, but she is Lee Hae-young. Lee Hae-young is my vote for the best actress currently working in film. She is extraordinary. And then there's Walk Up. Lee Hae-young also appears in this, although she's not the central character. And this is about this filmmaker turns up at this new sort of apartment block to see an old flame of his. And he wants to introduce this old flame to his daughter because he wants to get his daughter into interior design. So far, so boring. But then the film starts cutting forward to different times in the future. And now he's moved into the block of flats. And now he's having a relationship with one of the tenants. It's that kind of movie. Again, it's about psychogeography. It's about how a space and the people in it create their own kind of, mini universe. It's very beautiful and strange. I find them very funny as well. I've been in an audience with Korean people and they laugh their heads off at these movies, whereas Western audiences watch them a bit too seriously, I think, as art house films, Please give Hong Sang-soo a try this year. Please. If nothing else, watch his classic film, Woman is the Future of Man. That's probably his most accessible. And finally, Typhoon Club by one of the people I now think is one of the great Japanese directors, Shinji Somai. This was re-released in the US in a season of Somai films in September. It's now become my favourite teen movie of all time. It's one of the most powerful, strangest portraits of teenagehood I've ever seen, about these kids trapped in a high school during a typhoon. It moves from, very wry humour to a scene of sexual violence which is genuinely disturbing, to an ending which is so haunting. I think that some of the best youth movies I've ever seen come from Southeast Asia, particularly Japan, and this is my personal favourite of all time. Now, for those of you who've made it so far in this video, I bet some others have stopped watching, haven't they? The fools. But I thought, every year what I do for Senses of Cinema, I also pick my most overrated films of the year. So a special treat for those of you stuck with the video is a good old rant, a New Year rant. And all three films this year that I thought were the most overrated or crappiest films of the year were British. Yes, I'm afraid so. Now, top of the totem pole is After Sun. Oh my God. This was voted the best film of the year last year. I cannot count the number of ways I hate this movie. Honestly, I'd rather wipe my arse with ground glass than watch this film again. I'd rather sniff cocaine mixed with whale dung up my nostrils for 3 hours than watch this film again. Why do I dislike this film so much? It's not so much the film itself, it's what it stands for. It's typical of a kind of, middle ground art house film that's being pumped out these days. It's a tentative, small scale film. A girl going on holiday with her father. His father is split from the mother and they have an awkward relationship. That's it. That bothers me. It bothers me that we settle for so little. We settle for such small portions in our art films these days. And it's not as if the film is really ambitious in its formal strategies. It's like a sort of, photograph, snapshots of their relationship. And it does all those kind of classic shortcuts to emotion. A man sitting on his own, crying. A man crying is now one of those kind of things that people shove in, isn't it, to get the emotions going. You have a sort of song by David Bowie at the end to get, the emotions going. That's the big climax of the film. You stick in a song by David Bowie, which is 10 times better than the entire film put together. These things irritate me. When you think about the wealth of art cinema in the 60s and 70s, you were tripping over brilliant films every bloody year. Now we celebrate a tiny little film about, on such small bones, really, with so little ambition. Is this all we've come to? It bothers me. Another film that really bothered me this year was Living. Now, this was a remake of Ikiru, a famous Akira Kurosawa film from the 1950s about a man. He's a sort of civil servant who starts to look back on his life and realise how empty his life is. Now, Honesty Corner, I never really thought that much of the original film. It's regarded as a humanist classic. It's a very well-made film, but I've always thought Kurosawa paints in broad brushstrokes and there wasn't much depth, And I felt it about Ikiru. I felt it even more about this bloody remake, set in London in the 50s starring Bill Nighy. I found it almost unwatchable, actually. And what drove me to distraction about this film is, increasingly I'm coming to the opinion, two things. First of all, British cinema and British television used to specialise in period drama. It used to be something that the British did very well. They can't do it anymore. They just don't know how to realise realistically an old period of the past without shoehorning in loads of modern politically correct comments about it, which really pees me off. And secondly, it's so over-directed. It was directed by the South African Oliver Hermanus, and it's like every shot is kind of shoved in your face as a kind of, statement. That's not good direction. Good direction is about finding a conceptual approach, and then every shot feeds into that conceptual approach, feeds into that rhythm. Just showing off what you could do each shot is not directing. It just distracts you, it takes you out of the film. So despite Bill Nighy's best efforts at acting, I found this film incredibly irritating and obnoxious. And finally, probably the worst film of the year, the biggest turnip of the year, was Alex Garland's Men. The less said about this movie, the better. It has one great shot, the figure at the end of the tunnel, which I think is a great shot and a great moment. The rest of the film was shockingly embarrassing. I loved Alex Garland in the past. I love his script for Dread. I like his film Ex Machina. But this was a major misstep. Sorry, Alex. Back to the drawing board, mate. So that's my look through 2023. Please share with me your list of the 10 best films of 2023 below. I'd love to hear about them. What did you think were the most overrated films of 2023? Right at the end of the year, I finally caught up with the latest Indiana Jones movie. Not bad. Not as bad as people said it was. I mean, okay, Phoebe Waller-Bridge was annoying. The boy was completely gratuitous, and there was that stupid scene when he's flying the plane. What? But the rest of it I thought was quite entertaining. It was daft and silly, but I enjoyed it. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you have a fantastic 2024. It's got to be better than 2023, hasn't it? Really? It has to be. Thanks very much.